Oh, and welcome back to Plant Biology here at NICC. Our reading for this week is going to be in Chapter 26 of the Biology 2E textbook. We're going to cover Chapter 26.3 and 26.4. We're going to be looking at the angiosperms and then the role of seed plants today. With the angiosperms, we're going to see a different group of organisms than we saw with the gymnosperms, and these are really organisms that are different than these gymnosperms with the development of two novel structures, flowers and fruit. With the development of these flowers and fruit, we get this really intense focus on reproductive success. With the flowers, we get the development of different structures to ensure pollination, different abilities for plants to motivate other organisms to do their pollination work for them through the production of nectars, even pollen and things like that is a food source for a number of arthropods. And then with fruit, we get this protection of the seed for ease of dispersal, and it also allows very many different ways of seed dispersal, whether it's via the wind, via animals ingesting them, being stuck and clung to hairs. So this development of fruit and flowers is all about new and novel ways for pollination and then spread of these reproductive structures. Flower structure in the angiosperms is very diverse. There's lots of variations on this theme, but what we do see with all of the angiosperms in some form anyways is this general sort of flower arrangement, and figure 26.14 does a really good job of laying out all of these different parts of the flower, from the stigma, the style, the ovary, the stamens, the anthers. All of these different parts are going to be present in some shape or form in the flowers of the angiosperms. And again, these flowers are really in place for protection of the reproductive structures, as well as motivating structures for the pollination by other organisms, or if it's a wind-pollinated plant, again, it's going to be just those structures are going to be there to release the pollen into the environment. Figure 26.15 does a really good job of illustrating this sort of generalized life cycle of the angiosperms. And with the angiosperms, we definitely are still in this sporophyte generation dominant sort of lifestyle plan for these organisms. So when you look outside and you see an oak tree or something like that, that is the sporophyte or two-end generation. The gametophyte generations are going to be contained in the flower or as pollen. And so we do have this distinct alternation of generations within the sporophyte, or within the angiosperm group as well. Fertilization, as it occurs in angiosperms, makes for an interesting sort of variation on these reproductive themes. We get the fertilization of with the sperm and the egg. There we get this diploid zygote, but we also get this development of what's known as endosperm, which is triploid. So it's a combination of sperm with the polar nuclei, and that often develops into this tissue that serves as a food reserve for the developing embryo. And when we look at organisms, even like familiar ones like corn or beans, for that example, or even beans, for we're really the starchy part that we eat. That is that endosperm that the plant is developed initially as food for the developing embryo. So we see this endosperm and the development of cotyledons in the case of dicots that really serve as this food reserve for the developing embryo after fertilization in the flower. After fertilization, we generally start to get this seed development, and where we have this thickening of the walls of the ovary, and then eventually forms the fruit. And there's a lot of diversity in fruit and fruit types and things like that within the angiosperms. But what we do have is this development of these very specific structures for seed dispersal. And that's really the role of fruit, is to disperse the seeds. Whether the seed is wind pollinated, and so if you think about a dandelion seed, the growth of that little fluffy thing on top, that's part of that development process. If you think about a raspberry, that seed dispersal for there is motivating an herbivore to come in and eat the fruit structure. They gain nutrition from it, and then defecate out the seeds and spread the seeds in that way. So there's variety that are definitely possible within fruit development, but all the different forms and shapes that fruit take are all about seed dispersal. The angiosperms are a very diverse group as a group, but as a single phylum, they definitely come from only one sort of line. And so we have all of the diversity of the angiosperm group that we have on the planet was really coming from this single ancient ancestor. This single ancient ancestor really led to the development of these three major groups within the angiosperms: the basal angiosperms, the monocots, and the dicots. In some cases, you'll see the dicots known as the eudicots, but outside of any sort of very specialized conversation, everybody just calls them monocots and dicots as far as that goes. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these three groups in turn. The basal angiosperms, or the Magnoliidae, this group, usually we see more in warmer climates. Magnolias, for example, they can exist in Iowa. At least there used to be a really big, nice magnolia tree outside Becker Hall of Science at Wartburg College in Waverly. I'm not sure if that tree is still there. It's been a few years since I've been back. But these magnolias and the laurels and things like that, these are the sorts of organisms that we see within this basal angiosperm group. The next group that we see within the angiosperms are the monocots, and as the name would imply, one of the defining characteristics is the presence of this single cotyledon in the seedling. They also have veins that run parallel along the length of the leaf. The flower parts are arranged in 3s and 6 and symmetrical, and we rarely see true woody material in the monocots. So things like grasses, wheat, sugarcane, bamboo is a grass. We see a lot of these different cereal crops that we grow are in the monocot group. Rice is probably the number one monocot in the world as far as feeding human population goes. The root system with the monocots is fibrous. They don't have tap roots. They can often have adventitious rooting, where we have roots that grow from the stems or the leaves. We also have, within the monocot group, we have the lilies, the orchids, palm trees, things like that. So very diverse group, lots of different forms, lots of different functions within the monocots. With the eudicots, or the true dicots, these organisms have two cotyledons in the developing shoot. The venation pattern in the leaves is like a network rather than parallel. The flower parts come in 4s, 5s, or they could be whorled as well. The vascular tissue is usually very well organized in a ring in the stems, whereas again in the monocots the vascular tissue is scattered. Within the dicots, we can have herbaceous or non-woody plants, or we can also have plants that are producing true woody tissue. So there's diversity within this group as well. We can look at the arrangement of some of the sort of structures on the pollen to determine the differences, if that's sort of what your interest area would be. And there's also a diversity of rooting systems. There's usually some sort of main root associated with the dicots, and then often they will spread out. So the dicots are a very diverse group of organisms within the angiosperm group. Table 26.1 does a really good job of laying out some of these major characteristics, these structural characteristics, and comparing and contrasting the monocots and dicots. So looking at cotyledon numbers, venation pattern in leaves, the vascular tissue structure in the stems, the root structure, the pollen structure, and then the flower parts as well. Those are the main sort of structural comparisons that people use and day to day to determine whether these plants are monocots or dicots. 26.4 is really looking at the role of seed plants in the world around us, and what we're talking about really is how these plants are interacting with the environment that surrounds us. The first part that they talk about is herbivory, and herbivory is a big driver for the development of things like spines and toxic chemicals and waxy cuticles. Plants are not very mobile, right? We can generally outrun a plant, and so they've had to evolve these different strategies to prevent predation by herbivores, but on the flip side, they've also used fruit development as a means of seed dispersal using that exact same sort of mechanism. So raccoons eating raspberries and pooping those seeds out in the woods in different places is the plant exploiting that animal for its own purposes. It's these herbivory sorts of issues are a two-way street in many cases, but when we're looking at the development of things like spines, and if you think about stinging nettle, that burning sensation, those chemicals in those plants, that's definitely an anti-herbivory sort of situation. Also, the development of chemical substances like caffeine in plants is also anti-herbivory. Excuse me. If an organism eats a plant with high levels of caffeine and they get that jittery feeling from it, they may be less likely to consume that plant in the future. Humans, however, tend to like that sort of stimulatory effect found in plants, and so two-way streets for sure. Pollination is another great example of this coevolution with animals, where we have flowers that are pollinated by wind, generally inconspicuous, generally not very showy. Think about grass. Grass is a flowering plant. You've probably never noticed grass flowers before. Wind pollination, no real evolutionary advantage to have a big showy flower. If, however, you're interested in having a bee or some other sort of insect pollinate your flowers, you have to do something to entice that organism to that place. Generally, this is going to come in the form of nectar as a reward, so a sweet sort of syrup that the plant produces and an organism consumes. So hummingbirds, for example, have very long tongues and very long beaks, and they drink nectar as a food source. Sometimes there are orchids that are very, very specific in the type of species of organism they mimic to entice a mating response from an insect. The insect believes that it's mating with an insect. Instead, it's a flower that looks pretty much just like the insect, and the flower then attaches pollen to the insect, which moves to the next flower, hoping to mate. Instead, it's again a flower. And so this coevolution with animals and plants can be very complex and is always fascinating. So there's lots of strategies within these types of coevolutionary pathways. Some plants smell like rotting meat to entice flies and beetles and other things like that. So there's lots of variety within these strategies that plants use to entice pollination. Obviously, seed plants are also really important for humans. Much of our food resources, our building resources, come from these plant materials. There's medicinal properties associated with the flowering plants. Table 26.3 has a really nice sort of concise list of some of the major compounds associated with these plants that we use on a day-to-day sort of basis. And there's this diversity within the plants is something that, as a species, we need to conserve and work at our better understanding, if for no other reason, for our very own survival. All right, We'll move on to chapter 32 here in a new lecture. I'll talk at you later.